Welcome to the first Tuesday discussion in the winter term 2023, and I'm really, really happy to have Eyad Houssami here, who's come to us from Berlin, even though he's truly international person. My name is Christoph Mauch. I'm the director of the Revolts Council Center, and I'm moderating the Tuesday discussions every week. And we bring to the Tuesday discussions, we bring what we call environmental experts. So people who may be politicians, work in foundations, do permaculture, all sorts of things. Not necessarily the people who are normally, not academics from the ivory tower, even though Eyad could have probably done that too. He is a theater man, Theaterwissenschaftler, somebody who has an academic who's published a book on Arabic theater with a name that I forget, but I think the places are places. It's a name. What is Madrach or something?
The book is called Doomed by Hope.
Doomed by Hope.
Yeah.
But it's about these places in Lebanon.
Yeah.
Where the name is after. It's named after places where animals gather.
Sure. Yeah, I can intervene here.
You can intervene in a minute. So what I will tell you, other than that, is I didn't ask him to be here today because he's a theater man. Even though he wanted to be a circus star when he was little. Always wanted to be a theater person, and became a theater director. Organized a theater company in Lebanon. He originally comes from America. I hope I can remember all this because we only just met. He comes from Atlanta, grew up in Atlanta, got a degree in Yale in theater and politics, and then moved to the Near East, actually to Syria, with a Fulbright, and is about to finish his book on industrial agriculture in
Lebanon.
So
PhD,
totally his PhD in Leeds, totally different area, and that's what really fascinated me when I heard that he had spent years between 2014 and 2019, many years on an eco farm or something, an organic farm in a desolate landscape in Lebanon, and with interesting people, very unusual people who started that farm. A farm that used to exist, an old farm that used to exist but was gone because it was overgrown after the war years. Nobody even knew that it existed, and he will talk about that farm today. I thought it was so fascinating that, first of all, his biography is fascinating, that he wanted to learn about this farm and lived on the farm for many years, and at the same time he is writing about industrial agriculture, and he's a theater man, including here. I think you've got a company here.
I'm an artist in resident actually at the Theater Academy August Everding.
So a double biography. So I can't wait to hear about Lebanon, and maybe we can ask you a few questions about theater as well. But please join me in welcoming Eyad Houssami.
Thank you, Christoph, for that very warm and generous introduction. I'm really honored to be here. I've heard so much about the Rachel Carson Center for a number of years before I started my PhD, which was in 2021. And so it's really great to be with you all today. Thank you so much for coming. I will begin simply by reading a short text, and then I will cycle through some photos, and then we can have an open discussion. I hope that sounds okay. So the text that I will be reading is actually from the prologue of my dissertation, and it starts at the farm, Bassatin Baanoub, which is where I conducted an apprenticeship for about 5 years. This is the farm. Wild boars wreak havoc on farms. In my tent, pitched beneath epic olive trees, I would hear them grumbling throughout the night, frustrated by the metallic fencing newly installed to protect the terraced fields of Bassatin Baanoub from their insatiable appetite. Once, while hiking off the beaten path and tearing my way through tender thicket, I stumbled upon the boar's den, a shaded clearing carpeted in pine straw with cozy depressions in the earth. Another time, down by the Awali River that flows to the Mediterranean. Here you can see the horizon extends toward the Mediterranean. It was the whole clan, a few giant boars and their younglings. The grown-ups stared me down, making sure I wasn't a hunter. The dozen swine retreated calmly into the density of a forested slope, and I continued down to the sandy bank, their heaving as palpable as the wafts of sage and hide. The river appeared to be sick, due to the recent flush of agricultural wastewater from Lake Araun in Lebanon's Beirut Valley. Dragonflies outnumbered fish. I took a sip from my canteen, crossed the bridge, and wandered toward the ruins of the Ottoman mill on the northern bank of the river. Jean-Pierre and Yasmina, the directors of this farm, took me under their wing as a sporadic apprentice in the first years of the decades-long initiative to revitalize a 147-hectare ancient farm in South Lebanon, abandoned since the mid-1970s. Crowned by a Roman cum Ottoman citadel, engulfed by shrubs, the land is peppered with Byzantine coins and ossified artillery shells from the 1982 Israeli invasion, followed by the occupation of South Lebanon through 2000. By the time the Baanoub initiative took off, the Lebanese military had demined the valley, like many other areas of the south. Others on the farm, for instance Ali and Jama, both laborers from Syria, showed me the ropes, from installing dozens of beehives after midnight to mixing wild za'atar with fresh summa ground from berries sun-baked on the just-constructed roof. Sometimes Emma, visiting from France, would toil on the farm too. She cared for the lavender bushes like no one else. At the end of a long day's work, actually work never stops on the farm, I'd rev up the generator for a few hours of electricity and fire up buckets of water for a hot wash, since back then there was no plumbing system in the house. The dogs Mishmush and Shammam, which is Arabic for apricot and melon, would spawn 2 liters of puppies during those years. They would ward off the predators during the most tumultuous hours of the night. While my experiences on the farm in Lebanon shed light on the intersection of multi-species relationships, agriculture, and layers of history, the perspectives gained during my 2-month residency as a theater artist in Japan brought to the fore the scales of geopolitics that have impacted both ends of the Asian continent. From that vantage point, a place where the ravages of World War II are as latent as they are pronounced, I followed the official U.S. entry into the Syria war and the rising wave of Syrian refugees. The patterns, from the easternmost island nation of the Asian continent to the Arab Levant on the Mediterranean, felt so familiar, and the legacy of the so-called American century weighed heavily in both contexts. The story was not one of globalization, a favorite myth of some 20 years ago. It was one of fossil fuels' insatiable, boar-like appetite. The correlation between the unlikely duo of Japan and the Arab Levant, or al-Mashriq, found a tragic peak with the explosion of more than 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate in the Beirut Port on August 4th, 2020. A blast dwarfed by the impact and slaughter of the 2 American nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, yet evocative of that wrath and trauma. The Beirut Port cataclysm, the pink mushroom cloud, plunged the area of the COVID pandemic into new depths of misery. The period following the nationwide revolutionary uprising, starting October 17th, today's the 4-year anniversary, 2019, and ongoing freefall financial collapse in Lebanon darkened, literally. Fuel shortages intensified, as had already become common in neighboring Syria. At the port, enormous grain silos that once stood like sentinels protected the city from what could have been even greater devastation. They were all but obliterated by the blast, as mountains of lost wheat reserves refashioned the coastline into a gluten dystopia. The fertilizer exploded just across the highway from the neighborhood, Marb Khail al-Nahar, where I lived for 9 years. For a time there, I resided in a French mandate building, constructed to house workers of the nearby derelict train station. This ruin conjures the vast transportation network, spanning from Ghazi to Baghdad, from Medina to Istanbul, that once integrated Beirut into the Ottoman Empire. My yellow building was across the street from the Cinema Vendôme, a concrete monolith that had fallen into disrepair and neglect. I remember vividly when hours before sunrise, an interstellar machine of destruction arrived to tear down this monument to make way for a 30-story tower. Weeks later, activists protested the demolition of Beirut's cinema history on my street. They were marching, chanting in English, "Save Beirut Heritage! Save Beirut Heritage!" At some point, someone in the crowd must have convinced the person with the megaphone that the chant ought to be in Arabic. The person leading the march fumbled, struggling to construct the brief phrase around turath, or heritage. Meanwhile, my rowdy and exasperated neighbor, Madame Baboyan, interjected with her barrel-aged, raspy voice, "C'est trop tard, Beirut. C'est trop tard," which means it's too late, Beirut, it's too late. Around this time, the Arab revolts began to unfurl across the region. When collective action and mass protest shook Tunisia and then Egypt, resulting in the ousting of 2 dictators, few suspected that Syrians too would mobilize and agitate through coordinated national uprisings for political change. As a Syrian from the diaspora and having lived in Damascus in my early 20s, I was aware not only of the skill of the state as embodied by the Assad regime in repressing dissent, but also of the excellence of people in and from Syria in devising creative strategies in the struggle for dignity against tyranny, strategies reified in Arab and specifically Syrian theater decades ago. Nationwide protests erupted in March 2011 as the peaceful revolution began. A gruesome crackdown followed, and then a civil war spiraled into a world war. In the years since, the Syria war has exacted calamitous tolls on human life and society, with more than 500,000 killed and nearly 13.5 million, half of the entire population, displaced. The terrible violence has also damaged ecosystems and knowledge networks. With regard to agriculture, in a place that used to be the only Arab country that was self-reliant in providing its needs of wheat, vast tracts of land have endured severe devastation and attrition. The war decreased cultivated land by 30% on average and irrigated land by 50%. And here I'm quoting a source. Agrarian practices in peasant communities suffered considerably as warfare displaced custodians of knowledge. Based on my conversations of recent years with practitioners of alternative community-supported agricultural policy in Syria, most of the recent reconstruction efforts that have begun, even as the war continues, produce conditions that bind more than ever farmers to methods dependent on global institutions, neoliberal logics, and the international seed and agribusiness market. Meanwhile, financial, economic conditions have plummeted to new, unfathomable depths. As a result of the Kaiser Act, put into effect by the Trump administration in 2020, many such neoliberal policies and approaches have become economically infeasible. In neighboring Lebanon, and in direct relationship to these geopolitical and economic circumstances, public universities even suspended their academic operations because they had no fuel or electricity in early 2022, but universities have since resumed operations. With higher education and agriculture in such peril, I am desperate for a radical reimagination of how we understand, learn, and pass on the knowledge necessary for another kind of impossible and indeed ecological revolution. Communities in the Mashriq have, within less than a century, become entirely dependent on systems of industrial agriculture. Meanwhile, mainstream narratives about agricultural and societal history after World War II entrench the triumph of said systems, but at what cost? And whose and what species' expense? As I have argued, these forms of ecological control have resulted in the demise of knowledge transmission and in terrible scales of displacement and suffering within the span of a couple generations. Cognitive gestures that both kindle the legacies and point to the unknown or erased horizons of agriculture can unyoke the near hegemony of nitrate and fossil fuel industries on how we think and on how we inhabit ecosystems. The portents of ecocide and global warming are palpable, and just like the industrial systems that race toward them, such destinies are anything but inevitable. Thank you for listening. This is my tent. I had a tent for about, I guess, a year before there were a few structures on this huge farm. And so before the structures could house me, when I was on the farm working, I had a tent, and then I was living in Beirut. So I would commute to the farm, which was about an hour and 20 minutes away from Beirut. Lebanon is a very small country. The farm is located in the south of the country, east of the city of Saida, or Sidon. So it's 300 meters above sea level, and it's in a really stunning valley that I have just told you about and linked to some of the bigger questions that hover around my research on the history of industrial agriculture. So I will stop there, but I'll move to an archival picture to invite questions about my research. And thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited to hear what questions and comments and experiences you would like to share.